Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to disaster recovery, business continuity, crisis management, COVID, wellness, anything that helps you, your organization, or your community prepare for, respond to, and overcome adverse situations. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free, reach out. I'm the only Alex Fullick on LinkedIn. So I'm really easy to find and I do respond to everything I get. One quick announcement, I will be speaking at the Continuity Insights Conference, April 25th to 27th in Louisville, Kentucky. Fingers crossed, this could be a in-person event. And if it is, I hope I run into a lot of you and maybe twist a few arms and get you to come on the show. Longtime listeners or viewers on YouTube, you'll know that I love to read. I read 3 or 4 books at a time. They're all over the house. I read for entertainment purposes, education purposes. And I came across one book a little while ago. And as soon as I got it, before I even started reading it, I knew we have to get the author here to talk about his book. So I'd like to welcome the author of Business Continuity Management, a practical guide to organizational resilience and ISO 22301. The author, James Crask. James, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Congratulations on the book. I know it came out earlier this year, sometime earlier this year, right?
It did, yeah. I wrote it during one of the first COVID lockdowns here in the UK. So I didn't have that much to do other than write a book. So that's the product of that.
I think a lot of people wrote a book or took up painting or something during those lockdowns. But congratulations, great book, lots of information in here for users. Now, I know we've gone back and forth with emails and biographies and things like that. So I know who you are and what you do, but could you take a moment for our global listeners and viewers, tell us a minute or two, talk about yourself, what you do, and how you got into what you do?
Sure. Yeah. No. Thank you. So, my day job is working for Marsh, which are a global insurance broker, and I run their business resilience advisory service based here in the UK. So, my day job is helping clients prepare for crisis events and disruptions, hopefully avoiding them, but putting in place the plans to help recover when things go wrong. I also chair the ISO group that looks after ISO 22301, the business continuity standard, and some of the organizational resilience standards as well. And I've been doing that for a number of years. The last big project we were involved with there was the revision of ISO 22301, which came out in 2019. And really, I've always been involved in this kind of area of work. I started out life in various government roles here in the UK as part of a legacy from the Cold War planning days. Civil defence type organisations that would plan for big catastrophes. Ended up in government, in a part of government that advises the Prime Minister and Cabinet on crisis issues, and then made a step into the private sector. So I worked for PwC, which is one of the big 4 professional services companies doing resilience consulting for clients, and I had a short interlude break from consulting, working in the nuclear industry at a place called Sellafield, which is in the northwest of England, very remote location, but it's the home of all of the nuclear industry here in the UK. And I was running risk management for the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority. I think they say that Sellafield is one of the most highly hazardous sites in the whole of Europe. So it's quite a complex kind of set of issues that we dealt with. So that's me.
You mean you didn't fall into this like the rest of us did?
No. Well, I was I sought it out. And originally I was hoping to work for for FEMA in the US. So I did a degree that was all about natural hazards, really, and I saw job adverts in FEMA working on flood risk, but I couldn't get those jobs because of visa restrictions, and didn't really realise that the UK had something similar, admittedly on a much lower budget than the US have got for these types of things. And found my way into a role in as I say, in civil defence.
Oh, well, I'm glad you could join us today and take some time to talk about your new book. And again, congratulations on it. Having written a few myself, I know the challenges and what it's like to put one together. So congratulations to you on pulling this all together. Now let's jump into it. Let's start talking about some of the topics that you bring up in your book. The first chapter, actually it's the second one, but the evolution of resilience. So I want to get from you, what is your definition of resilience?
Well, I mean, this is a question you get asked. Yeah, for me, it's all about adaptation. History, resilience is about responding to the need for change, reinventing yourself, and adapting the business so that it stays relevant and can continue to operate. History tells us that there's a litany of organisations that have failed to spot the need for change, and of course, hindsight is a wonderful thing. It's easy to spot those companies that are no longer with us and point at them and say, clearly they didn't do something right. Those organisations aren't there anymore. It's sometimes harder to see those organisations that have reinvented themselves and consistently adapted to that need for change. I suppose one example of organisation that comes to mind that hasn't done a terribly good job at that would be something like Kodak. How many of us use film cameras these days? Should they have changed their business in response to the changing ways that we were all taking photographs, versus organisations like, I think I talk about Nokia in the book, that have reinvented themselves time and time again into the company it is today. So it's all about adaptation and change.
Yeah, I remember having as a kid Kodak cameras, Insta cameras, Polaroids, all these different kind of Kodak, and then all of a sudden, what felt like a blink of an eye, they were gone.
That's right. Yeah, and it does make me wonder. How many big companies today won't be here in 5, 10, 20 years time? Now, if you and I do that, we would be able to retire on the money we make on the stock market. But one of the things about resilience is about trying to spot those organisations, or the signs that those organisations might be heading for potential doom, effectively, and trying to address it before it happens.
So, with your definition in mind of resilience, are there limitations to business continuity?
Well, I think business continuity, firstly, what I'll say is it's a very, very important discipline and a very important capability that I don't think is any less important today than it ever has been, even with the birth of this new concept around resilience. But by its very definition, business continuity is all about recovery, and therefore it assumes that we've agreed a predefined point to which to recover to. So it's not necessarily thinking about how to evolve the business and change the business, adapt the business to meet future challenges. And I think that's probably where the big difference is between business continuity and resilience. I don't think you can have resilience without business continuity. I should say that it is very important.
And I don't think business continuity can really exist without some form of resilience incorporated into it either.
True. Yeah. I mean, when you think about look at the pandemic as an example of that. I have lost count on the number of business continuity plans that I have read in the past, certainly more recently, that were written pre-COVID, that explicitly write pandemics out of the scope, or make assumptions about the plan only really being effective in an environment where one or two, certainly a small number of geographical locations are impacted at the same time, i.e. you're able to then move processes around the globe. Well, of course, COVID has completely destroyed some of those assumptions. You could argue it's a failure of business continuity, but I think also it just points to the need for an extra layer of resilience thinking on top of business continuity to think about some of those scenarios that perhaps we're not necessarily well set up to deal with through our normal business recovery plans.
Yeah, I think COVID kind of took some of the blinders off in some respects, that we have to see beyond our usual fire flood type stuff. Now you can have fire floods in other places and still get impacted, like COVID. And to your point with plans, if our place is down, we'll do this, and this. We'll move here and there. Well, you know what? Those other places are down now too. But that didn't creep into our mindset because it never really happened in the way it has with COVID before.
There are other examples of recovery strategies that big corporates have today that suffer from the same kind of thinking. So think about cloud computing. And we've seen a few big disruptions of some pretty significant cloud providers over the last few weeks and months. How many times have you had conversations with executives about, well, it's okay, we're resilient because it's all in the cloud? Well, ultimately, anybody really tested how resilient your cloud provider is to big macro events like pandemics, like major electrical failures as a result of infrastructure failure, or even a solar storm, for example? They're all plausible events that we really ought to be thinking about. And I think one of the things that COVID has done is just demonstrated that you can't ignore those very low probability, high impact risks, which business continuity should be pretty well suited to manage. But I think pandemic has proven that there are some limitations there.
Yeah, agreed. Let's move on to another chapter. What can we learn from international standards? I always find this interesting. What are the benefits and potential pitfalls of following a particular standard? And should any organization adopt a standard? I ask because I know you've got ISO 22301 talked about in your book, but I've also got in my files, there's a Malaysian standard, there's an ANZAC standard, there's DRI, BCI, and all these other kind of things out there. So what are your thoughts on those?
Yeah, and you've got ACES, you've got Singaporean standards. There's plenty to choose from. There's certainly no shortage of standards. Take the benefits first. I think the main benefits in the name. A standard gives you a consistent standard way of doing something that you can then repeat, measure, and then compare. So that's hugely useful for organizations that are big, that have multiple locations, a distributed workforce, where you want to deliver some consistency in the way that you're doing something. And it also helps with efficiency as well, because you're not reinventing the wheel every time you're trying to deliver something. This, what's in a standard, because it's been written through a consensus process involving a whole bunch of global experts, should be pretty close to being best practice. And therefore, why reinvent something that somebody has already got the war wounds from writing and doing it the wrong way, potentially themselves? There are though pitfalls, and I cover some of these in the book, and I spend a lot of time with clients walking through these, particularly those that are looking to go down the route of accredited certification. I think there's quite a tendency for some individuals to take standards a little too literally. There is a difference in my mind between implementing a standard pragmatically to fit the nuances of an individual organization versus doing it dogmatically following the process without much, without giving much thought to how it will actually land in the business, whether it's actually delivering any real value. And sadly, I see quite a lot of those that example, that approach being taken in some organisations, and the result is that it just switches people off, and it stops people from engaging with the process. So I'm a firm believer that you should be very pragmatic in the way that you deliver the standard. Now, you might think that that's a little bit conflicts a little bit with a conversation about getting accreditation, which is all about making sure that you've delivered it to the letter of the standard ultimately. But I don't think it is, because I think if you look at ISO 22301 as the example, the shall statements, which are the bits that you're going to get audited against, there is sufficient flexibility in the guidance that supports that, to allow you to implement that set of requirements in a way that is pragmatic to the business. And I think that nuance is sometimes lost in the discussion around how to implement standards. The second question about should organizations adopt a standard? Well, I think it depends on what you mean by adopt. If you mean take the principles and the guidance that standards give us, then absolutely yes, I'm a firm believer of that. Basically, back to my point about the benefits that you get. If it's to achieve accredited certification to a standard, well, for me, that is a completely different conversation, and requires a significant amount of more thought before embarking on that journey. I often tell clients, be careful what you wish for with that, going down that route of accredited certification, because you'll get the investment to do it once from your exec, you'll get the certificate, everybody will be really happy, you hang it on the wall, slap on the back, but then you've got to do it again and you've got to maintain it, and that's where the effort lies, and sustaining the amount of exec level and management level input into the program after you've got that first certificate is quite hard work. That's not to say that there aren't huge benefits. I am a big believer of accredited certification for certain organizations, but you need to be very clear on what it's going to deliver to the firm in terms of the benefits.
Right, because then you've got to, either it's an annual or biannual, whatever it ends up being, we have to go through this whole thing again. And executives are going to say, but we already got our certification. Why do we have to continue doing this? Right. And that's that's the different mindset than let's achieve this goal. Yes. And as you said, you've got the plaque up on the wall. Great. Now we've done it. On to the next thing.
Yeah.
But then a year down the road, it's, wait a second, what? I have to do it again?
But there are some organizations that clearly benefit from it. And the argument for getting accredited certification is very strong. So organizations where you want to demonstrate to your customers that your trusted business, safe. Some of the law firms that I know get certification in order to demonstrate that they're not going to lose sensitive data, or they'll be able to recover in times of disruption. Then you've got organizations that are part of somebody else's supply chain, particularly smaller organizations. You get absolutely hammered by some of these big businesses on annual attestations of your resilience, questionnaires, procurement processes coming out. There is, and actually having the standard just show the organization, look, somebody else has told us that our processes are meet an ISO. That makes a lot of that assurance work go away and reduces the burden on the business. So there are definitely some examples where accredited certification really add a huge amount of value.
Yeah, I've got my plaque now. Go away, leave me alone. I have to ask the question then. And it just jumped out of my head. Oh, yes. Is following a certification or adopting a standard, do we run the risk of creating some sort of a program and processes in place that really aren't fit for purpose within our organization? Like, can they take us in the wrong direction and create some either unnecessary work or some ill will? Because why are we doing this? This isn't the way we do things here. Is there a danger of creating that kind of a friction and
Uh,
view?
I think there's always the danger of that, but I don't think it's the fault of the standard per se. It's in how you're applying it, and it goes back to the point I made earlier about you need to be non-dogmatic in how you apply the standard. Delivering something that is appropriate to the business is key. And the first question we should always be asking as practitioners is, will this capability work? And then everything else kind of follows from that. And it's a rather glib example, but if you pick up your business continuity plan and you're stood outside of your premises at 3 o'clock in the morning and there are blue lights everywhere because there's been some kind of crisis, if that plan doesn't tell you what to do within the first couple of pages, it's probably worth the paper it's written on. So asking that question, will it work? How am I going to use it? Who's going to use it? I think that's the place to start. The standards help you get there, but they're a means to an end, really.
Yeah. On that note, we've come to the end of our first segment. We are talking with James Crask, the author of Business Continuity Management, A Practical Guide to Organization Resilience and ISO 22301. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Today we are talking with James Crask, the author of Business Continuity Management, A Practical Guide to Organizational Resilience and ISO 22301. James, lots of great information in our first segment. I'm going to jump to another chapter now. Chapter 7, I think it is, Lessons for Business Continuity and Resilience from COVID. Now, COVID has impacted us a lot. What can we learn? What can resilience and business continuity learn from it?
I mean, that's a long podcast in its own right, isn't it, Alex? And we're only goodness knows, halfway through, 3/4 of the way through the pandemic. So I'm sure there'll be lots more to learn in the future. I think for me, though, the main lessons have been, and I mentioned some of this in the first session. The traditional business continuity plans, I think, haven't really stood the test of the pandemic in many cases, and that's because many business continuity plans were making assumptions about crisis events that would impact on specific geographies rather than the entire globe at the same time. And in that kind of thinking, it's possible to move processes, even move people to different parts of the globe to carry on operating. But the problem with the pandemic, obviously, is that everything was impacted at the same time, and it was also a demand side impact as well. So you had supply chain issues for many organisations, particularly in the early days. So the plans themselves, I think the scope perhaps needs to be properly stress tested, and the planning assumptions that are written into those plans need to be properly scrutinised. Moving on to testing itself, while on that subject, I think the pandemic has proven to us that we perhaps need to be a little bit more adventurous and challenging in the type of scenarios that we're testing ourselves against. How often have you been in an exercise and you get to the recovery phase towards the end? The fire's been put out and everyone's been accounted for. You're into recovery, and it's 10 minutes before the lunch break, and you're like, well, we'll do 5 minutes on recovery and then we'll have the debrief. Well, there's just not enough time, is it? There's so much complexity in that recovery phase that we never really properly scrutinise and never really properly stress test. So I think we need to be more adventurous with the scenarios that we're testing ourselves against, much bigger, more extreme scenarios, and we need to stress test the recovery phase much more rigorously than perhaps we have in the past. And then finally, the final piece I mentioned in my earlier introduction about supply chain. that being a real issue for a lot of organisations. It continues to be a big issue for certain industries as a result of the pandemic and a whole bunch of other issues as well, which I'm sure we can go into later. I think the pandemic has proven to us that just how little we know about our supply chains. Who supplies us, not just necessarily those tier one suppliers that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, but the suppliers, and what risks those organizations are exposed to. I don't think we've done anywhere near enough work on exploring some of the vulnerabilities there.
You staying on the topic of the lessons that we've learned from COVID, but maybe lessons overall. How do we recognize when or if there is a lesson to be learned? Do we have to wait for something to happen to us? We have to be impacted for us to actually learn something, or how do we recognize a learning situation?
Yeah, well, learning happens every day, and ideally, you wouldn't be waiting for a crisis event to then decide to learn. Absolutely. There's all sorts of opportunities that we could be seizing to learn better lessons from to further improve our resilience. Probably the easiest and most obvious is in response to exercises, because exercises are all about learning. Has the plan worked? Do my team understand their role in a disruption? Are they the right individuals to be involved in a disruption response? What do we need to do differently when and if it happens for real? But there are also some sort of more subtle kind of circumstances under which you could be learning. So finding out what your peers have experienced. You see it every day in the news of supply chain failures, of fires, of floods, of disruptions everywhere. Put yourself in their shoes. How would you have responded? Do you think your plan would have coped with the experience of that organization? So use other people's misfortune, I guess, to strengthen your own preparedness. But ultimately, as I mentioned at the beginning, learning happens every day, and a business continuity practitioner's job is never done. Every day there will be an opportunity to identify an improvement, either from within the business or from outside the organization, from what other organizations are responding to. The other source of information you could use is things like the World Economic Forum report on risks and other sources like that give you a sense of what the future risk landscape might be looking like. And you can just have a thought exercise in your mind, or even just as in a workshop setting with colleagues, think through how you respond to some of those things, or maybe before that, think through what the impacts will be on your business of these risks, and think about how you respond to it. That it's a kind of a mini exercise in its own right, but it allows you to think a little bit more creatively than perhaps you would otherwise.
Well, let's look into some of that information that we could learn from other situations. I know we chuckled about it, learning from other people's misfortunes, but what do we do with that information? If we see that our competitor is struggling on social media due to something that happened with them, what should we actually do with our own plans and our own responses? What do we do with this information that we're actually learning from, watching our competitor sweat, going through a tough situation? What do we do with it?
Well, the first thing to do is to triage whether the learning actually relates to the organization. Can we learn anything from it, I guess, is what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. And if the answer is yes, or potentially yes, then I would, and depending on how significant that learning is, it might be we need to update our telephone number tree or something like that, which is pretty low level. But if it's something a bit more substantial, I'd want to get people in a room to discuss it. Those stakeholders that you would expect to have to respond in the situation that in this fictitious kind of competitor has experienced. talk through their experience and how it would impact on their parts of the business, and out of that will come a whole load of information to improve. Ultimately, though, it needs that learning needs to be logged somewhere, and if you agree that you need to do something about it, i.e., an improvement needs to be made, that needs to be tracked, and I would suggest that then falls into your governance arrangements for maintaining your business continuity and resilience arrangements.
Well, on that note, let's move towards the governance, and because you talk about that here, developing the governance and implementing resources. So can you define what you mean by governance? Because some people think it is adhering to a standard or a regulation, but what's your definition from your writing, as to what governance stands for?
So the way I define it is aligned with actually another standard, a British standard, which is BS 11500, I think it is. So I define it as governance being the system by which an organisation is directed, controlled, and held accountable to achieve its purpose. So it's about leadership. It's about the policies that you need in place to direct activity. It's about roles and responsibilities to ensure that management execute that policy. And to a certain extent, it's also about process and the tools that underpin the delivery of that process to make it actually happen.
What kind of things should we put in place? Because I should have said it in my first comment here. When it comes to governance, people will think it's audit and compliance. So do we run a risk of having this whole thing become a tick box exercise, thinking that we're doing it for audit and compliance purposes? Or how do we embed governance into what we need to do so that it doesn't become an audit and compliance exercise?
Yeah, good question. For me, having good governance is complete opposite to that. It's about ensuring that the right people within the business are taking action and managing risk up to their level of authority. So in terms of what needs to be put in place, I guess you could probably separate this out into two components. You've got the governance that you need in to manage a crisis response, which is a little bit different to the governance that you'd have in place to build your business continuity plans and then maintain them. So I tend to use a 3 lines of defense model, which some of your listeners will be familiar with. But for those of you that aren't, the first line of defense are effectively operational management. They're the coalface. They're the people that are making decisions on a day-to-day basis about the delivery of services to customers, and delivering the bulk of the organization's activity. The second line tends to be where the policy is set, and that then drives that first line activity. And then the third line is audit and compliance, usually internal audit or some other form of independent scrutiny. I tend to focus on the first and the second lines of defence when I'm talking to clients, because that's typically where things go wrong, in my experience. So in the first line, what you would expect are a bunch of individuals that are responsible and ultimately accountable for writing and maintaining business continuity plans for their part of the business, because they're the individuals that know the business the best. They know where the risks are, and crucially, they have access to the resources they need to manage those risks. And then in the second line, depending on the size of the organization, you would tend to have a smallish team, maybe bigger if you have a big global business, that will be writing the policies, putting in place the tools and the processes that the first line need to write plans. They might be involved in some of the corporate level exercises that go on, and ultimately there is a bit of support to the first line, but also checking that the policy is actually being implemented in the right way. Now, if you get those responsibilities and accountabilities right, it becomes less of an audit compliance activity, and more of an activity that is driven by the business. It's recognized by the business as something that is of benefit to them, because it's all about managing disruption risk at that very low level, the first line of defense, as I mentioned.
Yeah, I think one of the problems some organizations have is either the initiative starts out from the audit and compliance group saying this is what you need to have, and then everybody looks at them, okay, what do I need to do? Rather than this is what we need to do, audit, I'm telling you what we're going to do, audit us against what it is we said we would do, did we do it, and prove that we can do it, right? Sometimes the cart comes before the horse.
Yeah, it's true. That is true.
Now, you talked about, excuse me, writing plans and procedures. When we're writing some of these plans and procedures, what are some of the questions we should be asking ourselves?
Yeah.
When we're developing
Yeah, that's a good question, because what it implies is that a lot of people, and I think this is true, just blindly jump into writing a plan and don't really take a step back and think about what you're trying to achieve. So the first question to ask, the first two questions to ask is, what and who is it for? What entity does it cover? Mm-hmm. Who's going to actually use this plan? Because that will inform some of the format, discussions, decisions that you have, the language that you use, even, and the way you describe things. And then on from that, what is the scope of this plan? Is it one particular location? Is it a region? Is it globe? Is it a division? Is it for a certain process or activity? So that will then again drive some of the context. And coming back to the who is it for? Probably the two ends of the extreme: executive team versus a very operationally focused role that might have a role in managing the immediate aftermath of an incident, fire or something. They're going to look and feel quite different. The operational team just want action cards, right? I need to do this, and this. The exec might need a little bit more guidance and support, because for them, this is a situation that for many executives is very unusual for them to deal with. Very few executives will have certainly more than one big crisis to deal with in their careers, so they need potentially a little bit more guidance and support. But not all plan will be the same. Is kind of what I'm aiming for here. They will all need to be tailored to the audience and ultimately what they're there to achieve.
In the first segment, you mentioned the line action items, in some of these plans, procedures within the first few pages. So what happens, or what do we do with all that, what I call fluff information that doesn't need to be there? It usually takes up the first 100 pages, sometimes just ridiculous stuff that no one needs. So how do you think we should structure our real action plans? The ones that we'd actually use, not the strategy that maybe audit needs to see, but the actual actions that people will use.
Yeah. Highlight it, cut it out of the document, and paste it into a different document. I was going to say delete it, but you do need it. You can't delete it. It is essential. So I think the best place for that kind of information is in what I would call a framework document that would underpin the plan. So you'd have a policy that sets the intent of what you're trying to achieve across the business, and you have a series of recovery plans. But then the framework document describes some of the how and some of the processes that you follow to deliver the plans. Audit will need to see that, but the person picking up a plan, as I said, at 3 o'clock in the morning with all those blue lights flashing around the car park, doesn't want to read 5 pages of policy information about business continuity or a training needs analysis of the people involved in writing the plan. They just need the actions. And in terms of the structure, as the second part of the question, I think think through the timeline of an event. So it's how will you first become aware of an issue? How will you be notified? And then who else needs to know? what are your first actions, your immediate actions on getting that notification? What are our recovery options? That's all the business continuity piece. Who do we need to involve? Other stakeholders that might need to be engaged to support the response, and who do we need to be communicating with, and what do we communicate to them, and how do we communicate, which is an absolutely critical part of the process. And actually, I mentioned in the books and research that my own firm did, Marsh, with Cranfield University a couple of years back, that showed just how important good crisis communications are in a disruption. Businesses that got it wrong lose on average 12% in their share performance and never really recover it. So it's a major incentive to get that right.
With the talking about the structure that you just mentioned there, would it be fair to say that you want to keep it obviously action oriented, but also kind of checklist oriented, without getting into the detail? One line may say, go to alternate site. I'll just pull that one out of the air. Go to alternate site, but not carry all the detail of get in car, go here, and all this other fluff that ends up in there, but keeping it general, straight to the point, so that people are able to adapt to, as you said at the very, very beginning, adapt to the situation. I need to do this based on the situation. This is how I have to do it.
Yeah. Really, the rule is that for me, you have just enough information in the plan to enable the reader to do something, to take action. We don't. You and I don't need to be told you put a seatbelt on every time you get in the car. But you might need to be told, you need to travel from A to B in order to carry on the response. So that said, some plans you'll end up with more detail in than others because of the readership, and also because of if it's a task that is unfamiliar to the readers, they don't do it very often, you might want to give a little bit more guidance. So if you've got an incident management plan that talks about how to shut the gas off to a production plant, well, that probably doesn't happen that often, so you probably want to walk through the procedure and how to do it. You get that wrong, that could be quite serious for the individual and the organization.
Yes. Now let's move to, because you kind of touched on it a couple of times here, but we haven't jumped in it. Training and exercising that, because that kind of continues on with these plans if people haven't done them too often. What are your suggestions on validating all this information and exercising all this information? What should we do? Who should be involved, and to what extent, and how often?
Yeah, good question. So I think training and exercising, you've got two broad groups of individual. You've got people that are involved in designing the planning, documentation, and writing the plans effectively. Now, they need a slightly different amount of training versus those that are actually involved in the business continuity response. And if I focus on that latter group rather than the former, the individuals that need knowledge of how to respond should be regularly engaged in exercises to build some muscle memory around how they would respond in a disruption. It's no good doing that every 24 months. It has to happen much more regularly than that. That said, the frequency of testing will be dependent upon a number of different things, mainly related to how often that individual will be expected to use those skills, and the level of criticality those skills are to the business as a whole. If I give you an example, the person that is writing the minutes of the crisis management team meeting, crucial role in terms of noting down the actions, probably doesn't need to be trained that often, because you're likely to be using somebody that maybe an executive's PA, for example, is used to doing that kind of task anyway, but just in a slightly different environment. But an individual that is responsible for standing in front of the media and giving a press conference in response to an event, that needs to be exercised a bit more and trained a little bit more frequently. So my suggestion is that you spend some time working out what the specific training and exercising requirements are for each of the individuals that you rely upon in a crisis, and build training plans specific to those roles.
And you mentioned executives. That includes them too in things that they would experience. Obviously, you're not going to train an executive, I hope, on how to rebuild a mainframe or recover an application or something. But you are going to need them to deal with board of directors, key, presidents of other companies, that they deal with, all of a sudden picking up the phone and calling them, media and things like that, right? You got to test them on what they need to do.
Absolutely critical. In fact, they're often probably the most important group to train and exercise, for the simple reason that this is very unusual to them. They don't do this every day. Mm-hmm. Even if they stand up in front of the media regularly to give press conferences on their share performance or something, they in those kind of situations, they're usually dealing with quite a friendly bunch of media. In a crisis, they'll be potentially dealing with a hostile media. And that's a very different experience, having seen it for real myself. I mean, we all see it on the TV and on news at night. Even if you think you're good at handling a journalist during business as usual, handling a seasoned war correspondent that's just come back from some war-torn country to come and report on your oil spill or something that everybody's suggesting you caused, is a very experience that needs to be exercised and trained frequently.
And on that note, we've come to the end of our show. James, thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise, and congratulations on the book, Business Continuity Management, A Practical Guide to Organizational Resilience, and ISO 22301. It's chock full of great information in here, very detailed, all kinds of examples. And James gave us a few today. So James, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. And to everybody watching and listening, stay prepared, everybody. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave a message and let me know what your thoughts are. If you'd like to be a guest on the show to talk about something related to business continuity, disaster management, COVID, personal well-being, anything that's relatable to those subjects, you can reach me through my LinkedIn profile, which is in the video description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. In the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.